Hey everybody, Jon Stewart here. I am here to tell you about my new podcast, The Weekly Show, coming out every Thursday. We're going to be talking about the election, earnings calls. What are they talking about on these earnings calls? We're going to be talking about ingredient to bread ratio on sandwiches. I know you have a lot of options as far as podcasts go, but how many of them come out on Thursday? Listen to The Weekly Show with Jon Stewart wherever you get your podcasts.
CNN has a major projection to announce, and that is Joe Biden will win Arizona. He is the winner of 11 electoral votes in Arizona. Joe Biden wins the state of Arizona, a major projection right now by CNN. Look at the votes, a little over 11,000 margin, 49.4 to 49.1. Joe Biden again has won the state of Arizona. Let's bring in now CNN's senior...
In November of 2020, nearly 1 week after Election Day, Joe Biden was projected to win the state of Arizona. While Biden had already won the election a couple of days prior by winning Pennsylvania's 19 electoral votes, his Arizona win further solidified this victory. So how then did Biden manage to flip a 2016 red state blue? Here on Nationally, we've talked about the Latino vote in Arizona, but another critical piece of the puzzle is Arizona's Native American vote. So what role might Native American voters play in the upcoming election? And do they have the power to sway key states, such as Arizona, Michigan, and Nevada once more?
Welcome back to Nationally. In this limited election series podcast produced by Immigrantly Media, we discuss issues that matter to some of the most overlooked immigrant and minority communities in the U.S. As the election season continues, we'll examine key moments that offer insight into what to expect in November. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the role of Native American voters in the up-and-coming election. We are your host, Juan Diego Ramirez, independent journalist.
And I'm Sara Sobdwani, a political science professor. And this is Nationally.
As a whole, Native Americans have a long and complicated history with the U.S. government, a history that is unfortunately full of oppression and displacement. In 1934, President Roosevelt passed the Indian Reorganization Act, recognizing limited sovereignty for Native American tribes and introducing the notion of federal recognition. As Politico explains, federal recognition gives tribes the right to self-govern and access to federal funding and programs. During the 1950s to the 70s, however, the federal government eliminated its relationship with various tribes in an effort to assimilate Native Americans into a predominantly white American society. Over 100 tribes were desertified, removing millions of acres of land from a protected status, relocating thousands of Native Americans to cities throughout the country, and forcefully adopting large numbers of indigenous children into white families. Today, there are 574 federally recognized American Indian and Alaska Native nations across the United States. There are, however, several hundred tribes that have not received federal recognition and therefore lack the funding and protection.
As of the 2020 census, there are roughly 9.7 million individuals who identify as American Indian and Alaska Native living in the United States, making up roughly 2.9% of the population. Roughly 60% live in metropolitan areas, with 13% living on reservations or trust lands. So, given this complicated history, where do Native American political preferences lie?
First, it's worth mentioning that a large number of Native American voters do in fact remain skeptical of the U.S. government, feeling that the government may not represent their interest. Despite the fact that President Biden named the first Indigenous cabinet secretary, a number of Indigenous voters claim to still feel voiceless in Washington, where they said that they felt, quote, ignored by a federal government that they say has inflicted centuries of harm, unquote. According to a Brookings report on a 2022 midterm voter election poll, 78% of Native American voters feel that the federal government has failed to live up to the treaties signed with Native American tribes and communities. The same 78% further feels that the government should return stolen land, while 82% claim that the government should pay reparations to Native Americans who were victims of their exploitations. Beyond feelings of distrust, however, it appears that Native Americans tend to, more often than not, lean Democrat.
In the same report, 56% of Native Americans reported supporting Democratic candidates in 2022 midterm House races across the nation, while only 40% reported supporting Republicans. So why might Native Americans tend to support Democrats? What is it that Native Americans care most about, politically speaking? It's unemployment. Native American communities continue to face disproportionately high unemployment rates, consistently far above the national average. In January of 2022, the nation's top-line unadjusted unemployment rate was 4.4%, while the unemployment rate amongst Native American workers was a startling 11.1%. For reference, this number is higher than the unemployment rate for white workers in June of 2020, just 2 months after the pandemic unemployment peak, during the heart of the nation's economic crisis. So what about today?
Last month, the national unemployment rate was just 4.3%, while the unemployment rate for American Indians and Alaska Native workers was a startling 9.8%, more than double the national average and far above any other racial group. It may therefore be unsurprising that Native American voters identified jobs and inflation as the most important policy issue driving their vote.
They identified abortion and reproductive health as the second most important issue, as many favor the protection of such reproductive rights. Other policy issues important to Native American voters include colonization, land theft, federal recognition, immigration, and climate change, another pressing issue that many Native American communities are deeply impacted by.
Federal recognition is also of importance, as politicians who support federal recognition of currently unrecognized tribes are likely to win the electoral support of those tribes. This was the case in North Carolina in 2016, when Trump flipped Robeson County red, merely by supporting the federal recognition of the Lumbee tribe. Democratic National Convention just ended, and this issue did come up. In fact, when the states were casting out their vote to elect Kamala Harris as the actual nominee, we had a young Native American from South Dakota bring up this issue.
South Dakota, how do you cast your vote?
How mitakiapi, chante washte na chuzapalo. In my beautiful Lakota language, that means hello, my relatives. I shake your hand with a happy heart. That is the spirit of my beloved South Dakota. My name is Chante Redis, and I want to say that my people, the Ocheti Shakoan, are still here. The 7 council fires are still here. Let me tell you what a Kamala Harris presidency will mean for me, my friends, and my community. More importantly, more opportunities, more good-paying jobs, better access to health care, and a quality education. That is the future we deserve, and it is the future we will win on November 5th when we elect Kamala Harris.
And this is a part of that really exciting roll call that the DNC had in comparison to the Republican roll call that's kind of lackluster. The entire DNC roll call was full of excitement, and this young man was dressed in his traditional clothing, speaking his language, and really laying out the case about what are the most important issues for Native Americans and for South Dakotans. I mean, you hear him there talk about how Kamala Harris, in his view, is going to bring more jobs, better health care, et cetera. All of those key issues that we've been talking about for Native Americans. Of course, there's these really big ones around tribal lands, et cetera. But at the end of the day, when voters go out to cast those votes, it's so often those kitchen table issues that are impacting all of us. And I think he brought it home in that moment. I also don't want to diminish these calls for recognition for tribal lands, et cetera, for reparations as well. And while the needle hasn't exactly moved on those topics, I do think, and I want to highlight Joe Biden's appointment of Deb Holland to the cabinet to serve as U.S. Secretary of the Interior, right? She is making decisions about land usage and is Native American herself, right? She is from New Mexico. She served in Congress. She's a member of the Pueblo of Laguna and a 35th generation New Mexican. So while that hasn't necessarily completely shifted those conversations, I do think it was minimally a symbolic step to having greater recognition of the issues that Native Americans continue to raise beyond those kitchen table issues.
I'm just going to say that unfortunately, the question of the Native American vote in November isn't quite as simple as political preferences, as having someone in a cabinet, or as having like this young man on the Democratic National Convention. Another integral part of this piece is voter turnout. The Native American community continues to face significant political barriers that limit access to the ballot box.
You're right. And a substantial portion of Native Americans still live within tribal communities. Their political contexts are therefore unique to the particular issues facing their communities. This includes significant distance from polling locations, frequent denial of the use of tribal land, of tribal IDs, language barriers, limited internet access, inconsistent postal service, and lack of political party outreach.
Many Native American voters have to travel 100+ miles round trip in order to access a polling station. In a speech delivered in July of 2023 at the Gila River Indian Community in Levine, Arizona, Kamala Harris expressed these very challenges.
No uncertain terms that the Native vote is under threat. Polling sites are too often hours away from where Native voters live. Ballots and voter information are too often not available in languages they speak. Postal service is irregular, and the use of tribal IDs has been denied. That it is so difficult to even register to vote because there is not an in-person registration site in the area, or because they do not have access to high-speed internet to register online.
Another pressing issue that some politicians are now attempting to rectify is the lack of party outreach. According to an NPR interview with Jacqueline De Leon, a senior staff attorney at the Native American Rights Fund, both political parties have been really negligent when it comes to the Native American vote. Often, there is an unfamiliarity. There's a fear of approaching Native American communities that may seem unapproachable, or there's uncertainty over how to approach Native American communities. And so there's just hasn't been an investment.
This may leave communities feeling ignored or left behind, creating distrust and disincentivizing political participation. For many of these particular communities, building face-to-face relationships is incredibly important. In other words, half-hearted campaign ads aren't going to do the trick. They want to see true investment. As Deputy Director for Western Native Voice, Tahin Perez told NPR, rural America broadly, but especially rural Indian country, still operates very importantly on relationships, on handshakes. This, he explained, is how voters gain confidence.
This is an important factor to consider when discussing the potential impacts that Native American voters might have on the 2024 election. And when we come back, we'll discuss those barriers, efforts, and more. Don't go anywhere.
We're back. Before the break, we talked about how Native Americans tend to lean towards the Democrats, but their vote is often suppressed on their way to the ballot box. Let's continue that conversation now. So now that we have a better understanding of the important political and historical context surrounding Native American communities, let's take a closer look at one state in particular in which Native American voters may have a significant impact on the election: the swing state of Arizona. There are 22 federally recognized Native nations within Arizona. According to the 2020 U.S. Census, roughly 6% of Arizona's population identifies as American Indian or Alaska Native.
At first glance, this number may appear small. However, in a swing state in which a few thousand votes may mean the difference between a win and a loss, Native American voters may have a massive impact on the outcome of the election. In fact, Native American voters were the key in helping Biden flip Arizona in 2020, the first Democrat to win the state in over 2 decades. Much of this can be attributed to the dramatic surge in the voter turnout amongst those who live on Arizona tribal lands.
Biden ultimately won Arizona by about 10,500 votes in 2020. This simply wouldn't have been possible without this surge of tribal votes across the state. For example, the total votes cast in precincts on the Navajo and Hopi reservations in northeastern Arizona rose from 42,500 in 2016 to nearly 60,000 in 2020, an increase of over 17,000 votes. On the much smaller Havasupai reservation, the total number of ballots cast doubled from 2016 to 2020, overwhelmingly in support of Biden. During the 2022 midterms, Native American voters turned out in large numbers once more, helping Democratic Governor Katie Hobbs secure a win. Might Native Americans in Arizona have a similar impact this coming November?
While a good number of Native voters in Arizona tend to lean Democrat, many ultimately register as independents and expect follow-through from elected officials once they have been elected. In a New York Times poll, over 4 dozen voters living around Phoenix and on the Navajo Nation, many Native voters, claim that their lives have not improved much in the last 4 years, suggesting that the Biden-Harris administration has perhaps not followed through on certain promises.
As a whole, Native Arizona voters share similar concerns to those of Native Americans across the nation, worried about issues such as jobs, inflation, abortion, reproductive health, federal recognition, immigration, and climate change. According to the same New York Times poll of over 4 dozen Native American Arizona voters, Native voters in Arizona are particularly concerned about the economy, expressing concern over unemployment and inflation. In the same New York Times story, Native voters pointed to the increased price of a simple loaf of bread, now costing residents $5. Inflation hits particularly hard in reservations already struggling with chronic poverty. One young voter even claimed that he is leaning towards Trump due to his economic concerns. This is where the party's handling of these particular issues will be absolutely integral.
The Democratic Party has expressed their intention to support Native American communities economically. In Vice President Kamala Harris' speech delivered in Laveen, Arizona in July of 2023, she conveyed plans of economic support.
In this community, in every Native community across the country, there are people with big dreams for the future. People with the ambition and the aspiration to start a business, own a home, get an education, start a family. But turning a dream into reality requires, when we're talking about economic opportunity, requires access to capital and financial services. Home loans, small business loans, lines of credit. And as we know, many Native communities are cut off from these essential resources. In fact, Native households are more than 3 times as likely to lack access to traditional financial institutions. So to address this inequity, our administration, President Biden and I, have invested more than $500 million in Native entrepreneurs and small businesses. And we are investing millions more in community banks.
During this time in office, Trump claimed that he would support improved business opportunities and infrastructure in Indian country. However, as argued by the United States Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, Trump ultimately failed to put forward any substantive plans or proposals to improve economic opportunity in Indian American communities. In 2020, he actually excluded many tribal businesses from emergency coronavirus relief funds. In his current campaign, it appears that Trump has mentioned Native Americans very little, though his consistent promise of economic improvement may still be appealing to some Native voters. So what else? As a whole, Native American voters in Arizona expressed their desire to have their basic necessities met.
Another massive concern for Native Arizona voters is climate change. Many are worried about Arizona's increasingly deadly heat and less frequent rainfall, making it much harder to grow crops. One voter claimed that the deserts have become so hot that she can no longer run around barefoot the way she did as a child. Voters fear a president who will threaten their access to clean air, water, and land. Some even fear that Trump will place Republican desires to drill for oil above their tribal rights. In the same speech made in July of 2023 in Levine, Arizona, Harris said,
"In partnership with communities, and in particular with Native communities, we are also addressing the climate crisis. Every year, the land your tribes have long called home have increasingly been threatened by wildfire, drought, and floods. Native peoples have served as responsible stewards of our environment for millennia. And in order to create enduring solutions to the climate crisis, we must then rely on the knowledge and the experience of Native communities. And that is why we are investing billions of dollars to help fund Native-led, not Native-consulted, Native-led climate-resilient infrastructure projects."
As for the issues of abortion and immigration, Native Arizona voters remain relatively split, though they find these issues to be of importance.
One of the big issues in Arizona is immigration. I mean, we just can't say we're going to build a wall. That's not going to stop them.
Look, I'm all for helping the next guy. What about your own people?
When we think about borders and we think about building walls, we're actually separating families, Native families, indigenous families that were here thousands of years in this space.
That border wasn't there. Our people used to go all the way into Mexico. So that's kind of heartbreaking to see that wall go through our community.
It's frustrating to see all the resources poured out to different people from different countries, and we can't even address our own.
I've worked alongside Dreamers. I've worked with them in the classroom, and they're beautiful people.
I've met with so many different tribes, and so many are still struggling. No plumbing, no water, no electricity. It's a shame.
What can we do in policy where people don't die in the desert? I mean, where's the humanity in that?
I think we're very pro-life because we're pro-culture. Without our kids, we have no future. And as Indigenous people, we would be exterminating ourselves.
You know, I think your body, your rights, in my view.
I don't know why, but as female, we're always being attacked as far as where our health is concerned. And I think as a woman, I as an individual should make my own choices based on my personal health and not leave it in the hands of politicians.
On a personal note, I was a teenage mother myself, but I never thought of having an abortion because we were poor. The Republican Party, hey, if you're so pro-life, then you know what? Get up and sign pieces of legislation that will give people enough money to raise those children.
Closing her speech in Levine, Harris took the time to recognize the disparities that exist within these communities and the history of oppression and displacement that they have faced.
And a symbol of sovereignty. President Biden and I also believe that we have a duty to address the deep disparities that persist across Indian country. Disparities that are the result, and truth must be spoken, disparities that are the result of centuries of broken treaties, harmful assimilation policies, displacement, dispossession, and violence. And we have a duty to make sure that all Native people have the opportunity to thrive.
At a rally in Glendale, Arizona in early August of this year, Harris reiterated her support for Native American tribal sovereignty, saying, "I will always honor tribal sovereignty and respect tribal self-determination." Trump, conversely, has ultimately said very little regarding Native American voters in Arizona or elsewhere. However, in a 2020 speech, he claimed to stand with Native American communities.
I'm fighting for every American of every background, race, color, and creed, including Native Americans. That's why I'm here, Native Americans. Under this administration, you will never be abandoned. I will always stand proudly with our incredible Native American communities, always. Last week, I put forward a vision for Indian country grounded in respecting tribal sovereignty, promoting safe communities and building a thriving economy, delivering better health care, and protecting Native American cultures, languages, and history. Over the last 4 years, I created a nationwide task force to combat the crisis of missing and murdered Native Americans, especially women and children.
Here, Trump references putting America's first peoples first. Forgotten no more. A document his administration released promoting everything they had done and hoped to do for Native Americans in the U.S. However, as the United States Senate Committee on Indian Affairs was quick to point out, the document was essentially an attempt to rewrite the Trump administration's record on Native American issues in what they refer to as several misleading ways. This includes attempts to claim credit for work primarily accomplished by the Senate and House Democrats to advance priorities held by Native American communities across the nation. They further argue that this document ignores much of the damage Trump did to Native American communities, including consistently desecrating sacred tribal lands on behalf of corporate polluters, refusing to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act, excluding tribal businesses from emergency coronavirus relief funds, attempting to open sacred lands to resource exploitation, and much more. Yet, as a whole, it seems that neither party is campaigning sufficiently enough to Native American communities, including those in Arizona and elsewhere. Yet, as a whole, it seems that neither party is campaigning sufficiently enough to Native American communities, including those in Arizona and elsewhere. And as we did research for this specific episode, it was difficult to find current examples of either party campaigning within these communities, though admittedly more challenging to find Republicans examples than Democratic ones.
It's one of those pieces, I've complained about this in the API community for a very long time, where candidates and parties recognize that they need votes from these communities, but ultimately they swoop in and pay lip service. And after the election, so often the candidates never bother to come back. And I think that's oftentimes the frustration, not only in the Native American community, but for so many communities who feel like they've given their vote. We could think about that from the perspective of the pro-Palestinian cause. We could think about it for APIs, for Latinos, for Black voters as well. And I think it's no different here for Native Americans as well.
It is. It has become like the drop-off, the issue that you put in the back burner. But if Tim Walz and Kamala Harris wins, this means that there might be a Native American governor in Minnesota.
That's right. So Tim Walz in Minnesota as governor ran with Peggy Flanagan, who is Native American herself. She appeared at the DNC and apparently has been going around talking up Tim Walz to Native American tribal communities, to folks across the country who aren't very familiar with who he is. She said this: "I think Native people are strategically located in swing states across the country, and our vote, the Native vote, can make or break a campaign or election. So in many ways, ignore us at your peril," she had said. Pretty powerful words.
Those are very powerful words. Yeah, as some Native American leaders emerge, I do see Native American voting power improving in the U.S. It might not be as fast as we would want it to, but I see a brighter future.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Nationly podcast. brought to you by Immigrantly Media.
We hope you like this episode. Nationally releases weekly on Thursdays on all streaming platforms.
If you have thoughts you'd like to share with us, please email them to info@immigrantlypod.com or reach out on our socials @immigrantlymedia on Instagram and @immigrantly_pod on X.
You can find me @JUANDR47 on all social media.
And I'm @Sara Sadwani on all the platforms.
Nationally is produced by Sadia Khan and Sofia Sanchez. This episode is written by Emmanuel Monahan.
Our sound designer and editor is Juan Velez. The Nationly theme music is by Simon Hutchinson. Additional music is by Epidemic Sound.
Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.